The end of summer means parties before the new year of classes start up.
They thought Katie was just the greatest, so she really made a big impact on a lot of people, and everybody knew her, loved her.
In the college town of Los Cruces, the population spikes at this time of year, but that means more people than ever coming and going. With so many new faces, even the safest neighborhoods can become terrifying.
In essence, she really solved her own crime.
With DNA evidence so important, it could take changing the law to find the truth. It's the end of summer, 2003, in Los Cruces, New Mexico. Katie Sepich is getting ready for another year of school. She's a recent graduate of New Mexico State University, but returning to get her master's degree.
Katie was born in 1980. She was just a delight. I mean, she was full of life. She was quite a character. So she'd do things sometimes where she'd get in trouble, and so I'd ground her. And then the next day she'd come in and go, "Hey, Dad, if I wash your Suburban, can you take a week off my grounding?" And I mean, everything for her was negotiable.
On the Friday of Labor Day weekend, Katie has to finish up a shift as a waitress before going out with friends.
Our little sparkler, and she was a lot of fun, and she loved people, and she loved to entertain kids. The owner of the restaurant told me that there was one family that came in with their kids and they'd wait until there was a table in Katie's section because her kids liked her so much.
She also was a beverage cart driver at the country club golf course, and she did that on weekends. Some of the police officers knew Katie from the golf course, so they knew who she was. Even our former governor knew Katie, and they thought Katie was just the greatest. So she really made a big impact on a lot of people.
Katie heads home after her shift, but it's a Friday night, and she has no intention of staying in. After changing, she's off to see her boyfriend and some friends at a local bar.
Joe is a really pretty nice young man and very intelligent, came from a really good family. He and Katie had been dating for quite a long time, and he had graduated and had moved back to his hometown to work with his father in their business. So he had come home back to Los Cruces for that weekend, and that's why Katie and her friends were all getting together to kind of see him again.
Joe and Katie have been seeing each other for 7 months. They go shopping together to buy Katie a ring that she's seen wearing later at a party.
She was very enamored with Joe. She told me, "Mom, I think this is the one. I think this is the one I'm going to marry." And so we had actually started talking about wedding plans, although, it was probably a little premature, but we started talking about it. She was very smitten with him. We had met him. We liked him. He had spent time in our home. Things were progressing with them.
Katie isn't originally from Los Cruces, but moved here after being accepted into the university.
We used to joke around and say that Carlsbad High School basically picked up and either went to New Mexico State University or Texas Tech. And so she went with the kids that went to New Mexico State. And she loved it there. She really loved it. She loved it so much she decided to get her MBA there. I think it's a wonderful place. It's close enough to El Paso to have good airport access. It's close enough, to have good health care, but it's still small enough to kind of have a small town feel. To me, it's that perfect size, and it's a beautiful town. And Katie just absolutely loved it.
It's a great place to live. It's a great place to raise a family. You know, we don't see a lot of issues being so close to El Paso. You know, we've got the human trafficking aspect, but they're usually passing through. They're not setting up shop here. The violent crime takes place in Juarez, so we don't see a lot of increased violent crime due to the cartel activity in Mexico because they take care of it all in Juarez.
With the new school year about to start up, the population of this college town has hit its usually end of summer boost.
You know, you always gonna get the student population that rises every time the school starts again. You know, you'll get maybe an increase in population of 10, 12,000, students and support staff, faculty, that kind of stuff that come back to Los Cruces.
Of course, on top of a new school year coming, the holiday weekend has local police ready for anything.
We got holiday weekends, it's pretty much the same. You're going to have an increase in drunk driving, you have an increase in party, you have an increase in those kinds of things. So the police department back then tried to do the right thing, make sure there's enough manpower to cover parties and stuff that's going to happen because it's a holiday weekend.
A lot of friends came back to Los Cruces that had graduated, and they had a big party that night. It was like 12 people or something.
When Katie is all ready for a night out, she goes out with Joe and some friends at a local bar where the group kicks things off.
It's a Friday night on a long weekend, and they're college kids, so of course they want to have some fun. They close down the bar and then move on to find another party.
The bar closed at 2, and she met a bunch of her friends there that had come home for the Labor Day weekend or back to Los Cruces for the Labor Day weekend to visit. And then they went to a friend's house, which was about 4 or 5 blocks from where Katie's house was. So one of her friends had rented a house with some of his roommates. They were having a party that night to kind of get back together with the people who had graduated.
The party goes on. Everyone's having an amazing time. That is, until Katie isn't.
She ended up walking in on her boyfriend, kissing another girl, got mad, obviously, and
Katie became very, very angry, and they very heated argument, and she just decided she was going to walk home. And apparently she couldn't find her purse, and she just left in a huff. Didn't take her purse, didn't have her keys, didn't have her phone, just walked out and started walking home. And it wasn't very far, 5 or 6 blocks, like I said, very safe neighborhood. So I'm sure she wasn't afraid.
I think in Katie's mind, knowing Katie, I think she was thinking he would follow her, and try to talk her into coming back, because she did leave her keys and her purse there, and I think she had the intention of him coming after her. She went ahead and walked to her house, which, like I said, was 4 or 5 blocks.
The next day, Katie's parents receive a call from her roommate asking if they've seen Katie.
We were having a Labor Day party at our house. We had invited a bunch of friends over, and we had a swimming pool, and everybody's gonna, come over and swim. And we were in the process of getting ready for that, and it was almost time for everybody to start showing up. And we got a call from Tracy, Katie's roommate.
Tracy had called us at about 2 in the afternoon and said, "We can't find Katie." I'll never forget, I answered the phone and she said, "Have you talked to Katie today?" Because she knew that Katie and I talked every day, several times a day. And I said, "No." She said, "We can't find her." Well, she went ahead to tell me that she had called all of her friends, the hospitals. So we told her to report Katie missing, to make a missing persons report.
Well, I had gone to the store to get something. I don't remember what it was. So as soon as I got home, Jan told me Tracy had called and they couldn't find Katie. So I said, "Well, I'm heading over there. I'll go find her."
Dave, my husband, was on his way over to Los Cruces. He had gotten in the car as soon as we knew that Katie was missing, and he was on his way over.
At the time, I assumed that she just had gone to stay with somebody, that night. So when I got to Los Cruces, I pulled up to Katie's house and I went in. I knew immediately that something was pretty drastically wrong because there was a police chaplain and a victim's advocate and a police officer there that kind of told me what had happened. Now, at that point, they didn't really know any of the details. That was just, they knew she was found and she'd been murdered. So they kind of went through it with me and kind of told me what they knew at the time. So I sat down and I was kind of in shock, I guess is the best way to put it. I trying to figure out in my head what was happening. I mean, because it was so surreal that, you just never in your dreams think of, you're going to be in that position. So they asked me to go identify her body, and probably the hardest thing I've ever done in my life. I mean, to go in and I just broke down. I mean, it was horrible to have to do that for your child. So I saw her face, I just fell to my knees. And it was so shocking, and you could tell that she had had a lot of trauma. So it was pretty shocking to me.
When I first heard that Katie had been murdered, I thought whoever did that had to be very, very strong and very determined, because Katie was very strong and very determined. And I knew that she would have fought. She would have fought with everything she had, and she did. There were lots of evidence that she had really fought hard. And she did have that blood and skin under her fingernails where she had really fought for her life.
Katie Sepich is a recent graduate of New Mexico State University, preparing to return to the school to get her master's. She goes to a house party with her boyfriend, but her night comes to an abrupt end after catching her boyfriend kissing another woman. When Katie isn't heard from the next day, she's reported missing. But soon after, a body is discovered, and her dad IDs her in the morgue. Katie's body is found in a dump about 3 miles away from her home.
A man and a woman had gone out, they were going to do some target shooting, and they found her body. So at that time, they didn't know who she was. She didn't have any ID on her, no purse, nothing. So, they just knew that she had been raped and murdered. It was later in the day that the police put 2 and 2 together and figured out who it was.
Yeah, I was doing my normal on-call rotation, and we got a call about a missing person from the city and simultaneously a body recovery in the county just outside of the city limits. I was directed to get in touch with the sheriff's department and see if we could assist with the homicide investigation and try to determine if that missing person or that if the dead body was our missing person.
Police arrive at the site of the reported body and canvass the area. Near the body, the police find tire tracks and take photographic evidence.
Katie is found with her top still on, but her pants have been removed and wrapped around her. The initial investigators at the scene assume that she's been sexually assaulted, and this is confirmed when her body's removed and taken to the lab for examination. On top of this, her back is partially burned, seemingly in an attempt to burn away any evidence post-mortem. The cause of death is deemed to be strangulation. However, bruises around her body and skin under her fingernails is consistent with having fought off an attacker.
When Katie's body is found, her ring is missing, but she'd been wearing it that night. So what happened to it? With Katie's body being found outside of the city, the crime is found to be under the sheriff's department's jurisdiction.
But initially, that night, we went to the sheriff's department, just tried to get a game plan and an investigative plan to figure out how we were going to approach it.
The decision is made to have the sheriff's department run the investigation, with the police staying on for assistance.
We went to the sheriff's department. They had already, before calling us, they had started processing the crime scene, and they were interviewing people. Once they identified the body as Katie Sepich, and that turned out to be our missing person, then we ramped up interviews from everybody that was at the party.
At first, when we were on our way over there, I had been keeping in contact with Katie's roommate and also her boyfriend. And her boyfriend called me on my cell phone and said, I'm with the police. I'm having to go down to the police station to answer questions. And so they were taking him down. So at that point, I knew something was wrong.
Katie's boyfriend, as well as everyone else who was at the party, is interviewed by the investigators. But after the interviews take place, they don't appear any closer to finding their perpetrator.
It was a couple days later that Katie's roommate, they were leaving the house because they didn't want to stay there. And her roommate went out to water some plants because she was going to go stay with her parents. And she went out around the side of the house where those bushes were, and she found Katie's shoes. And they were laying there, it was like sandals. And they were laying there in that rocky area. And so she immediately called the police and said, I found Katie's shoes. And her roommate verified that those were the shoes she was wearing that night. So they knew that's where the crime had taken place. And you could see how the gravel was messed up where there had been a struggle.
In any missing person case, you want to really go through the missing person's residence and find out whatever we can find out. And it was actually one of her roommates that a few days later was doing something in the yard and noticed one of her shoes was along the side of the house.
Police come back to Katie's residence and investigate further.
And there was gravel on the ground, and you could see the imprint of her body on the ground. And there were, pretty bad scratches on her back where that gravel had scratched her. Then they realized that was a crime scene.
Evidence shows that Katie was outside her window the night of the murder.
So from there, he had taken her body out to that dump area and dumped it out. And that's when they found her.
With Katie leaving her purse at the party, she's locked out of her house. Her friends and family believe she goes around to her window to avoid waking anyone inside.
The roommate's mom was there visiting and helping them. They were going to be bridesmaids, and so they were making the bridesmaids' dresses. And so the mom was in the house, and she was asleep.
And she didn't want to wake her up by ringing the doorbell. Didn't have her keys, but they had an evaporative cooling system, which means you leave a window open a little.
Discovering that the crime had happened at the house changes everything for investigators, especially since they already have someone who admitted to going by the house that night.
We know she had a fight with her boyfriend, so we started interviewing her boyfriend. But there were inconsistencies in his statement, and he and his friends stated that, Joe made a big deal to say that, he was trying to call her and check on her, and he had all these text messages and voicemails that we discovered. However, he also knew at that time that she didn't take her phone and didn't take her purse, and that he actually had that stuff there at the party. That was very odd to us, and he claimed that he and his friend went looking for her and drove by the house. Initially, we were pretty focused on her boyfriend as our primary suspect. He refused to give us DNA. He hired a lawyer right away. We were trying to figure out how we were gonna get his DNA. He left town right away after that. He went back up to Gallup, where he was from. After the first night, he refused to speak with us anymore.
The police believe Joe has the motive. By his own confession, he can be put at the scene of the crime. All of this and his refusal to give DNA make Joe the top suspect. Katie Sepich goes out to a party on Labor Day weekend, but the fun comes to an abrupt halt when she catches her boyfriend kissing another woman. When she isn't home the next morning, her roommate reports her missing. Soon after, a dead body is found at a landfill. It's determined that Katie made it home that night, but she's attacked while trying to enter through her window. She's strangled and raped before having her body taken to an old dump and lit on fire. Cold Case Squad detective Ricky Madrid is brought onto the case in hopes that a fresh set of eyes can help find the answers.
So I was not part of the original investigation, but in reading the reports, I knew that she had been at a party with the boyfriend, I guess a typical college party hangout, close to where she was living at the time. I knew Katie, had met her before. I knew she worked at one of the local restaurants here. I used to play golf with the local country club. Katie worked there as the bev cart girl, and that's where I got to meet her, to know her, hi to her. And she was a college student, like a lot of girls that worked there at that country club at the time. Trying to supplement income, get a part-time job to be able to help pay with books and school and so forth. Typically what we were doing at the time was, reviewing all the report statements, looking over what the previous investigators had done. I think they had done a good job up to that point. It looked like they had exhausted all leads that they were coming up with.
Homicide investigators work in teams in most cases, and usually you hope to put two on there. For the obvious reason, you want one person to be the main contact with the family, and you want one person to sort of sit back and take notes and analyze all the different things going on. So you're working as a team.
It always helps to have another set of eyes, away from the original investigation to see maybe something was missed. But from what I had seen already, it looked like, they were on the right trail. They were doing what should have been done, interviewing everybody, going over the evidence. The biggest piece of evidence that I saw was the DNA. Obviously, Katie had fought off her attacker. She basically solved her own murder, really, because she was able to scratch this guy pretty good and fought for her life. And so that's where the DNA was found, I believe, under her fingernails. I was not part of the original investigation, but obviously in reviewing the autopsy reports and stuff, we knew that there was a DNA match of an unknown male.
While the police investigate Katie's murder, her family continues to do all they can to help.
I was obsessed with trying to solve the case. I had a pad by my bed, and at night I'd be laying in bed thinking, well, what about this guy? What about this guy? And I was trying to figure out who did it, any clues I could come up with, or anything that had happened in the past that might lead to somebody. And so I kept in almost constant contact with the detectives. They were very gracious, but I think I drove them crazy because I was always, did you guys think of this? Did you guys think of this? And so, but they were great. They actually were awesome to work with. During Katie's funeral, they had some detectives here going through all the cars that were in the parking lot of the church and in that area, looking for tire prints. They did have tire prints at where he dumped her body. So I worked with them constantly for 3 years. Well, during that period of time, we started talking about the DNA. We knew their DNA. My youngest daughter, who was only 9 at the time, started doing a lot of research. My wife did a lot of research on DNA, and we were trying to learn how it was used in the justice system.
When Katie was murdered, there were just almost no clues. There were no witnesses, there were no fingerprints. They just had almost no evidence whatsoever, except when they did the autopsy, they found that she had fought really, really hard for her life, and there was blood and skin under her fingernails, and they were able to extract that, create a DNA profile, and upload it into the United States National DNA Database called CODIS.
The acronym for the American System for Tracking DNA is CODIS, which stands for the Combined DNA Index System, which had always been in place but was only effective for when someone was convicted of a crime.
When the detectives told us, or told my wife, that taking DNA upon arrest was not legal in New Mexico, that they could only take it after somebody had been convicted of a felony. So we said, well, what can we do to change that? Because basically my idea was to get a bigger net. I mean, I figured this guy's out there somewhere. We just got to find a way to get him.
And the detective, Robert Jones, said, oh no, Jan, it's illegal in New Mexico and almost every other state in the United States to take DNA when someone is arrested. We have to wait until they're convicted of a violent crime. And I felt like I'd been kicked in the stomach. You know, we had the evidence, but how long would it be if we had to wait until someone was convicted of a violent crime?
They were frustrated upon finding out that they had DNA under her fingernails that they couldn't match to anyone. And the family couldn't believe that when they had prime suspects that they couldn't take DNA from.
The police are trying to find a way to either catch or rule out her boyfriend. Detective Mark Meyer's partner might know a way to get the DNA legally.
You know, we had taken the bed sheets and the bedding from Katie's room when we processed that scene. And he had the brilliant idea of testing that because we figured that weekend that Katie and her boyfriend might have been intimate. And so we tested the sheets for DNA, ended up finding her boyfriend's sample on the sheets, which excluded him from the homicide. And at that point, he voluntarily turned over his DNA sample so we could officially exclude him as a suspect.
Getting these results means that everyone connected to the party has been ruled out by DNA evidence.
So we had ruled everybody out. So it was pretty dark times because then you knew it was worst case scenario. We knew that it was a stranger. It's just so difficult. You know, we had entered the DNA into the CODIS system right away and weren't getting any hits. And we had other leads, but we were able to rule them out, like I said, through DNA. No one that we asked for DNA during this case, except for the boyfriend, refused. We had consensual swabs from everybody we asked for, every suspect that came up, everybody that came up on the radar. We were checking the sex offender registry. You know, we were grabbing prison calls, we were grabbing jail calls. We were doing everything we could to try to figure it out. And every road was a dead end there for a while. It was pretty bleak for a while.
Everyone close to Katie has now been ruled out, so the investigators' only hope is to get a hit on the DNA evidence.
We're sort of moving along, plugging along, you know, even though daily we would look at this case and trying to come up with stuff. We get a phone call from Albuquerque DNA lab up there where the CODIS that ran it for the whole state. And they told us, hey, we've got a hit on the Katie Sepich case. We're shocked. We're like, oh my God, finally, thank God it's about time.
When the hit on CODIS comes, the investigators are given the name Gabriel Avila.
We start trying to do our background on this guy. Who is he? You know, and I later on find out that I guess he had already been in jail, in prison, for another assault that he had tried to commit, I guess, months after he had murdered Katie.
Well, the crime Avila committed was months after Katie's murder. It took years for him to finally reach prison and have his DNA be put on record.
So he had been stalking another student at the university and had gone to her apartment. And I have no doubt he was going to rape her and kill her too. And I think he realized how hard it was to strangle another human, and this time he had taken a knife with him. What he didn't expect when he broke into that lady's house was her roommate was home. And I'm sure he wasn't anticipating that. And so he got freaked out. They called 911 and we ended up, patrol division ended up catching him outside of the apartment. and charging him with a litany of crimes. That went through all the way through the trial process. He was convicted, and for whatever reason, the judge didn't take him right into custody. He let him have the weekend to get his affairs in order, and he was supposed to turn himself in. At that point, he fled to Mexico. So had he been forced to turn himself in, it would have been a different story.
So it was after he came back and was sentenced to prison 3.5 years later that when he went into prison, they took his DNA. And then they ran that through the FBI database, and that's when they got the match.
Labor Day weekend, 2003. Katie Sepich is out at a party with her boyfriend until she catches him kissing another woman. Katie leaves the party, deciding to walk the few blocks to her home. At some point during her walk, she is seen by Gabriel Avila.
Since she leaves her purse at the party, Katie doesn't have her keys on her when she arrives home.
Rather than waking anyone up inside, Katie instead circles the house to her window. Katie is attacked as she goes toward her window. Evidence points to her fighting back, but she's ultimately strangled to death and raped right outside her own home. But Katie isn't found there. Instead, after her death, she is taken to a nearby dump. Once at the dump, alcohol is poured onto her dead body, and then she's set ablaze.
It can take hours for a human body to burn completely to ash. Even burning a body beyond recognition would require an accelerant or extra fuel.
More than 3 years pass between Katie's murder and having Avila's DNA come up as a match. The police have their primary suspect, and he's already in prison for another crime, but they still have work ahead of them. They are going to need proof if they're going to get a conviction and bring an end to Katie's case.
I was pumped. We were excited because we're going to finally solve this case. It was like starting fresh again, but of course we're picking up the case after the fact, way after the fact, a couple of years, maybe 3 years after the fact, and it was a matter of just making sure that everything, all the I's were dotted, the T's were crossed, to make sure that we have everything we need to make sure that when Gabriel Avila is charged, that he's got no choice but to plead guilty to all the charges. We just started plugging away, and we were able to track down his ex-wife, the vehicle that he used that night when he murdered Katie to transport her.
Speaking to Avila's ex-wife, the police learned that the truck he had at the time of Katie's murder was sold. But not only do they learn who bought it, but his ex-wife gives them an unexpected piece of evidence. Avila's ex-wife was just beginning to discover how dangerous her husband really was.
He said he was caught doing a burglary and made up some excuse, but she sat through the trial, and so she realized that, hey, wait a minute, this guy's a monster. And so she went and got the truck, and they cleaned out the truck and sold the truck. Well, when she was cleaning out the truck, she found one of Katie's rings. So she brought us the ring, and sure enough, it was Katie's ring. And that played a huge part in our interview of Gabriel Avila later. And then we were able to find the truck, we were able to find all the tires, and just put a nice bow on everything before we went and interviewed Gabriel.
So they found his vehicle and they checked the tires, but they did not match the tire prints where Katie's body had been done. But they were able to find out where he bought those tires and went there, and coincidentally, the guy still had the original tires that he took off the truck because they were still good enough that he could resell them. And he had them, and sure enough, they matched the tire prints.
Armed with solid evidence, police prepare to get a confession from Katie's killer.
Let's get a confession and try to avoid a trial.
You know, Mark did a tremendous job of conducting the interview with Mr. Avila.
At first, Avila invents a story about being with his cocaine dealer that night. While he admits to raping Katie, he claims that his dealer is responsible for the murder. That is until he learns just how much the police already know.
And so I showed him the ring, and I told him if you had just raped her and didn't kill her, you wouldn't have kept that ring. You needed a souvenir, you needed a memento of what had happened and what you did. And you didn't sell it, you didn't turn it into cocaine, right? You kept it, you held on to it. And at that point, he gave it up. Confessed to raping her and strangling her there at the apartment, or at the house, and dumping the body. He admitted to everything. The only thing he wouldn't tell us is why he dumped her at that spot. Something about that spot that was important to him, and he wasn't going to tell us why that spot, but he told us everything else.
After confessing to Katie's murder, Gabriel Avila pleads guilty to the crime. The judge accepts his plea, sentencing him to 69 years in prison. The investigation spans more than 3 years, but it's finally put to rest. The police work closely with Katie's family for the duration, but it isn't always easy.
For me, talking to the victims was always the hardest part of the job. And when you don't have any good news for them for so long, like I said, you can only tell them you suck so much. So I remember that, and I kind of always felt bad that there was that brief period of time. It wasn't long. I mean, you know, you suck it up at some point and say, all right, I got to get a hold of them.
This was a joint investigation between the Sheriff's Department and the Los Cruces Police Department, and they were really excellent. And early on, they asked my husband and I, did we want to know everything, and did we want to be kept informed? And we said, absolutely. They were wonderful about that. They did ask that we not speak of the things they told us to anyone because they didn't want to harm the investigation, and we honored that. But they were wonderful, and they never gave up. You know, a lot of times murders become a cold case when there's just no progress in the case. And literally, for over 3 years, none.
Thanks to teamwork and dedication, Gabriel Avila is brought to justice. But Katie's family doesn't stop there.
When it was solved, and then when there was the sentencing hearing, because there wasn't a trial, he did confess, he did plead guilty. And when there was a sentencing hearing, of course, we went to that. And after that was over, we had a thank you dinner for all of the law enforcement and all the people that had been so very involved, and like I said, never gave up.
If Avila's DNA could have been taken sooner, he would have been tied to Katie's murder only months after her death. So it's been Katie's family's mission to change the laws around DNA and crime.
3 months after Katie was murdered, Gabriel Avila was arrested for aggravated burglary, but we didn't have Katie's law in New Mexico then, so we couldn't take his DNA sample. Consequently, it was 3.5 years after her murder that his DNA was finally taken upon his burglary conviction, upon his incarceration.
So we started talking about the law, and we visited with some legislators, and we got one of our local legislators to sponsor a bill to change it.
Their first step is to change the law in their home state of New Mexico.
For the next 2 years, I just did all kinds of research, wanted to find out everything I could. And about 2 years after Katie was murdered, our family decided to make it our life's mission to try to change laws so that DNA could be taken at the time of arrest. And that was what started the mission of Katie's Law. When I first started working on Katie's Law in Santa Fe, I didn't know anything about politics and about how legislatures were set up and that kind of thing.
And my wife spent 30 days visiting with all the legislators. At first, it was to take DNA from all violent felonies. And we passed that law in 2006. Actually, it went into effect January 1st, 2007.
Now, if you have an arrest for just being a suspect, you can take the DNA. So it's like a birthday present for policing when that happens. And it was the family that drove this. It wasn't law enforcement. It wasn't elected officials. It was a victim's mother that fought and fought and fought to put this in place, which is true community justice.
But changing the law in their home state is just the beginning.
I was proud to partner with them to introduce the Katie Sepich Enhanced DNA Collection Law at the federal level, to honor Katie's memory and to help other states pass their own version. I'm proud to say that 2 days after what would have been Katie's 32nd birthday, the Senate passed our bill unanimously.
You know, my first state to work in was New Mexico, and I thought, oh, I got this. Then I went to South Carolina, and I realized very different world. Well, it had to be state by state by state, and I worked at it for 17 years. And it was very daunting. It was very difficult. And there are now 31 states in the United States that have some form of Katie's Law.
The fact that Katie's Law was fought for by David and Jan, that would have made a big difference because we would have been able to take his DNA a lot sooner.
I think back then, if Katie's Law had been in place back then, or something similar to that, her murder would have probably been caught sooner than later.
Since the tragedy of Katie's death, Katie's Law has changed the way DNA is gathered and used to solve crimes across most of the United States.
Every morning, I go out on my patio and I say, good morning, Katie, good morning, God, you know, and I talk to her. I know she's still around. I know she's working. She wants this to happen. And not too long before Katie died, I was talking to her because she was working on her MBA, and I asked her what she was going to do with that MBA when she got it. And she said, Mom, I don't have a clue. I'll figure it out. She said, but I know I'm going to change the world. And I think she has.